Story. My name is Tegan Aline.
My name is Melanie Nevis.
And today we're going to be talking about Joan of Arc. Yay!
I feel like you've been super excited for this one.
Well, I was excited before when we talked about it just because I was curious. And then I started doing the research and looking into it. And then I'm not even gonna lie, I legitimately cried over this story. And I know,
Really?
yeah, I'm hormonal and pregnant. So a toothpaste.
That's fair.
A toothpaste commercial will make me cry right now, but I was just like, wow, this one's really powerful. And it's interesting because it's definitely in terms of a female saint, it's a really filled out story. And I guess because of her impact that she had on the country of France, that's why the story is so fleshed out. But I don't know, I drank the Kool-Aid hard on this one. I was like, wow, this chick was something incredible. Holy shit, her determination, her own energy was insane, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So yeah, I am kind of excited.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
How much of it, how much did you know about Joan of Arc before beginning the research?
Not much. What I knew about it before. First of all, like I said in one of the other podcasts, I've seen her statue in almost every church I've ever been in France. And I didn't know why. Now I know why. And I totally get it. So there was that. The other thing is I knew that she was a warrior during the 100-Year War in between Britain and France. You know what I mean? Or I knew of the 100-Year War, but I didn't actually know what it was about. And I knew that she was an impactful figure for that. And I knew that she heard voices from God. But that's it was the outline details, very Merlin-esque, very Arthur-esque.
Okay.
It's one of those stories I think we all kind of grow up with, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that the
nitty-gritty
the
details.
nuances of the story. Yeah.
Okay.
So that was kind of where I was at. And I don't know, because warriors were not interesting to me as a child. I was never really interested. I was obviously more of a princess bitch than I was a warrior bitch, but that's definitely changed. So in my older age, I appreciate this story so much more than I ever did when I was younger. So it's nice to revisit it. Yeah. So
Okay,
I guess
cool.
on that note, on that note,
you almost sounded Australian with that, because I feel like they put R's, invisible R's into everything.
I can't do it. I can't do it.
I suck at it too. I know a few people that can do it really well, but not high.
Yeah, if I do it, I sound like I'm trying to make a joke of it. You know what I mean? It doesn't sound real. Anyways, on that note. Yeah, so I think it's really important to set the stage a little bit before we get into the story of Joan of Arc specifically, because there was a lot going on in the period that kind of led up to her becoming who she inevitably became. You know what I mean? And I think it's important because it was clearly very heavily so a driving factor. So for some context, again, we're dealing in the period of the 100-Year War, which was 1337 to 1453. And that is a huge war. So that's insane, thinking about just 100 years of war. That means that there are people that grew up and died repeatedly in the period of this, more than one generation.
They knew nothing else.
And died in this period. And basically it started because, we know royalty, they always kind of marry each other. So you'll marry a princess from here, from this country, to a prince from that country, and so on and so forth. So basically what happened is that King Henry VI of Britain, he declared that he had the right to throne over the person who was going to become the king of France at time. He declared his right to the French throne over the person that France saw as the next king, which was Charles VII. And so that is kind of how the war started. He basically declared a war on France because he thought that he was the rightful heir to the throne. But the people of France thought that Charles VII was actually the rightful heir to the throne. And we're also dealing in a period where France was not exactly unified France. Like we've talked about that multiple times, but
right, yeah. You're looking at city states and
well, it's
just like a lot of
the
division and
feudal
yeah.
era. So there's almost like a bunch of smaller countries within the area of
Mm-hmm.
France. There's all of the lords that would own the land, and particularly the group that's kind of most important in this story is the Burgundians, which would have obviously been all of the lords from the Burgundy area, which is like in the east part of what we know of France now. And they
Mm-hmm.
had taken at one point, they had their area in Burgundy, but they had also taken Paris,
Mm-hmm.
and they had also taken Rennes. And that place, I hope I'm saying that, Rennes, Reims, I hope I'm saying that right. But this is a really important city. It's about, I think it's a couple hours from Paris, and it's in the north of France. But like, it's important because it's got the church that every king of France has ever been coronated in.
Oh,
So
okay.
if a
Wow.
king is going to be coronated in the country, they would get coronated in that church. I've been to that church, and it's got a vibe. It's quite cool. It's weird to think that every royalty that ever was a part of this country was coronated in that church.
So they all walked those steps.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
So
that's weird.
those areas were captured by the by the Burgundians, and then I think there was another area that they had also taken as well. And then everything else was kind of, I mean, still broken up, but generally like looking at the king of France as like a certain level of allegiance. Like there was still all of the lords, there was all of the lords here. This is after all of the stuff had already happened in the south with the Cathars, I think, as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
like there was a certain level of unification from what I understand, but it wasn't like complete all the way through. And the
Right.
Burgundians are particularly interesting as well because they were allied with the British.
Of course they were.
So they were kind of working with the British to let the British take over. Or I don't know enough about the Burgundians. Maybe they had an alternative motive there I'm not aware of. But at least in the case of this context, they were working with the English as they were trying to take over France. So
No wonder France has such a love-hate relationship with the British.
that's exactly what I said. I was like,
I feel like,
like
yeah.
the land doesn't forget, you know what I mean? So that must be why people are not so keen on it, you know?
I feel like a lot of countries have a lot love-hate relationship with the British. A lot of cities do too. Like,
Oh yeah.
but yeah, France in particular.
I could tell you some really, I won't get into it, but I have some really funny anecdotes around that whole. I had a really interesting conversation with some Brits recently about that. Yeah, it's safe to say a lot of people have their, again, it is a very, like, I wouldn't say hate, but a love. There's
Disdain.
conflict, like
Yeah.
you like the people, but you don't necessarily like what their country stood for. So anybody that like is proud of historically what their country stood for, you're kind of like, oh, red flag. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. I mean, not even their flag is their own. They stole it from the Genovese.
I didn't even know that. That's wild.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, yes, lots of reasons. Lots of reasons in the world to be frustrated with the English.
Hmm.
um so obviously, basically the British came in and they started like trying to seize everything, and because they had help inside, they were kind of somewhat successful. They were quite successful because they actually had really strong areas. They didn't have the whole area of France, but the areas that they did have were like some of the strongest, you know what I mean? And
Right.
that stands for something. So another thing that's really important to add into the mix, like if war wasn't enough, this is also the period in which the Black Death is
Hmm.
happening. So from 1347 to 1351. So this is kind of like, in the middle of the 100-Year War, let's say, there's a devastating pandemic caused by fleas. Fleas are transmitting this disease all around that, and it estimately kills 25 to 30% of the entire population of Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Not just one country, but like all of Europe is
Yeah.
kind of getting decimated. And it's causing a lot of stress within the communities, of course, because people are dropping like flies, and people were getting really like we're dealing with the Black Death in France as well. So we talked about it before in previous podcasts where something like this at that time can really, I think we were even talking about the Black Death, but it can cause all kinds of issues in the economy, in social
Mm-hmm.
structures, and hierarchies and things in that. So those two things are all happening at once, and people are living, literally being born, growing up, living their whole lives, and dying in that state.
Yeah.
It's a really dark, dark period
It's a
for
shit
Europe.
time.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
everyone like romanticizes and glorifies the past. It's kind of shit. There's a lot of aspects of it that were really, really terrible.
Oh yeah, I know. We love to, even I think what we love to do is romanticize like medieval royalty or like Renaissance royalty, this or that. But at the end of the day, even within that, there was still so much going on. And if you look
It was
outside of
not
the
good.
context of royal families, like people were like starving and dying constantly. Like you couldn't be middle class didn't really exist. You couldn't be a middle class person
No.
and survive through all of those things, right? And
No, not at
actually,
all.
funnily enough, I mentioned middle class because, and then I want to start talking about Joan of Arc. So Joan of Arc is born in the year 1412. So she is very much, born in the middle to end of this
Mm-hmm.
100-Year War period. She's born in a village called Domremy, France, in France. Domremy. Remy. Yeah. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but anyways, there's an accent aigu on the E, so I'm like, I think it's a long E. Anyway, she's born there in 1412, and this is kind of like almost central France, I want to say. Like she's very close, she lives very close to Orléans, which in English we would know as Orleans,
Mm-hmm.
which is what we named New Orleans after.
Yep.
Orléans here, and it's considered kind of like the gateway into the rest of the country. You know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah.
Like this
Yeah.
kind of like I would like usually when we drive from north to south, once we're in Orléans, I know we're like almost halfway home. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
context. So she's born in 1412 to a father who is a farmer, but he's a farmer who owns his own land. So he's not necessarily working the land of others. He owns his own land, and he also
Huh.
contributes to his community by being one of the ones that collects taxes on
Oh,
everybody else.
so he's like a laird in Scotland.
He's
Like,
not actually considered such in France. He's just considered a farmer, but he's, in a way, he's kind of like involved with the community on some level, even though it's like he kind of helps with the collection of taxes. It's not like he's not like the tax collector, but he's kind of going around
no,
and,
but like it's like an Outlander how they go around and collect taxes, like all the lairds
but the lairds
of
collect
their.
taxes for themselves though, and in this case he wasn't collecting it for himself. He was just like the middle person to like pass it along, I think. You know what I mean? So it
Well,
wasn't.
lairds collect taxes to themselves, but then they have to pay taxes on, like, they have to.
But so I wanted to mention it just to point that he was like, kind of involved in his community in that way. He was considered a farmer, but I think a lot of people position Joan of Arc as like a poor peasant girl. And in my mind, their family is not exactly like that. You know what I mean? There's a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
going on there. And her mother was in charge of educating her children. I think Joan of Arc had like three other siblings as well. So there was like about four
Okay.
of them in total. And I think she was the youngest one. So the mother is in charge of the education, and the mother's very, very religious. We are in an era of like Catholic France
Yeah.
at this point. We're also in an era of Catholic Britain as well. So Britain was very Catholic. This is way before Henry VIII comes along and decides
And
to start
fucks shit.
chopping his wife's heads off.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So we're dealing in a Catholic kind of structure here.
Mhm.
And so from a very early age, Joan of Arc is being raised to be quite like pious and devout. And she adapts to this like naturally. And she's just a very, very devout, incredibly religious child for a young girl.
Right.
Um,
Because, well, it's easy to indoctrinate children. Yes.
Well, again, that's why I want to paint the context of the state of the world, right? Like
Yeah.
when also I feel like at the same time when there's Black Death going around and a war that's been going on forever, God might be one of the few things you feel like you can like hold on to because it's hope. It's some form of hope. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I
So
totally get it. And at the same time, I'm just like, but if
not
there's a God,
everybody
why
indoctrinates knowing
inflict?
that they're doing that like as a psychological, not everybody's like a lot of people indoctrinate other people because they believe it themselves, right?
Oh, for sure.
But yeah, for sure it's
For
definitely like
sure.
an easy target at that time.
Yeah.
I'd say. But
Yep.
regardless, it takes. But she has, I don't know, she's something else because from a young age, she starts to experience like visions of angels and saints coming and speaking to her. And from a really young age, she starts to receive visits from Saint Michael.
Hmm.
And Saint Michael, he's one of the archangels, and he's also the archangel of like protection,
Hmm.
and he's kind of the one that you would think of in terms of battle protection, anything like that. And so he starts to tell her in her visions that she needs to go and fight for Charles the Seventh.
Hmm.
That if she goes and she fights in the war for Charles the Seventh, and she goes and delivers a message to him that he's going to become the king, then it will happen. So she is now feeling like she's getting imbued, like she believes that she's been imbued with information from heaven and from God that
Hmm.
says that Charles is going to be like he's the rightful king, and that he's going to become the rightful king. But in order for her to go, in order for it to happen, she has to like go into the war, into the battle. So
Right.
so in 1429, at the age of 17, Joan of Arc, yeah.
You do
I,
really
I
brave things when
I
you're
lo-
young.
I love your face. Your face. I wish people could see your face when you're like, I hate this, but okay.
I don't have very good control over my facial reactions.
No,
I'm like a very open book.
no, but I totally like. I understand it. Like from our modern perspective, it's so hard to hear. Like it hurts to hear that at that age, that's what she was having to go and do, and that
At the
she
same
felt,
time, that
and
is
that
the
she
time that you feel bravest
True.
and like
That's
you
true.
can
And
do it.
rebellious. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
true. But also, I feel like that she felt that she had the weight of this 100-year war on her shoulders to finish. It's also like bonkers, right?
Yeah.
So she approaches Robert de Baudincourt. I hope I'm saying that right. Baudricourt, maybe. And he is like a local military commander. And she seeks support from him for her mission. So she goes to him and she tells him, "I'm receiving messages from the Archangel Michael that the King Charles or Charles the Seventh, King Charles the Seventh, he's going to be the king. We're going to win
Hmm.
this war. We're going to win the war." And honestly, she's a 17-year-old girl, so she gets dismissed.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, no, there's no way anyone would take her seriously just like that.
Yeah. So
They would think
basically,
she's a little delusional.
they kind of just like laugh her off, and I think something ends up happening. They laugh her off, they send her away because she goes to Orly, I think it's to Orléans? No, she goes somewhere else. She goes to another village to convince this guy with her uncle, and they just not having it. So she ends up going back to her home village, and in this time her village was relatively untouched by the British through most of the Hundred-Year War. Like it wasn't ravaged by them. But in the time that
Mhm.
she goes back, they do come and invade her village, and then her family is forced to flee, and they end up going to again to this bigger village where this commander was. And so again she starts asking him for to see the king. Like she really wants to meet the king, and tell him that he's gonna win. And again, he's not listening to her. But she starts to kind of, I'm not, no, hysterical is not the right word, but she's getting really upset because she is
Mhm.
convinced that she has to share this message. And she is so empowered that this is what has to be done, that people like other people in the military around, they start to believe her. They're starting to
Right.
gain faith in her. Like they're seeing
Right. Because
some,
she's
they're
just
so
she's got
determined.
such conviction.
Yes, she's got conviction, and she's incredibly determined. So
Mhm.
they are like hearing all of this, and and people are starting to kind of be drawn to her. And the
Mhm.
commander sees it. You know what I mean? So finally
Mhm.
he talks to her privately, he listens to her, and then he understands what people are seeing in her message. So basically, she gets taken in by the military. She cuts all of her hair. She cuts her hair in the style of like a boy from that era. So almost like what we would call
Right.
a page boy haircut. She
Mhm.
starts to dress like in military clothing.
Attire. Mhm.
And I think the thing is that she ends up being taken to Charles VII, who is in hiding. And one thing I didn't mention is like in the middle of this 100-year war, there's something really messed up that happens. So King Charles VII, he's not the king at this time. So Charles VII's father, who was the king of France at this time, this
Mhm.
guy gets really sick and kind of starts to lose his mind because of the war. And
Mm.
so he is not really able to act as king. So his wife at the time, and I'm not 100% sure if that meant that his wife was actually Charles VII's mother, but his wife at the time is kind of acting like a regent.
Okay.
And in this period where she's acting like a regent, she signs a treaty with the British, and it kind of delegitimizes Charles VII's right to the throne. And it kind of leads to speculation that she wants to end the war. So
Mhm.
it kind of leads people to think that maybe he's not actually his father's son. And
Mm.
all this, it effectively made things a lot worse,
Yeah.
and like
Yeah.
open the gates for like, because this happened over a long period of time. So there's two kings from England kind of coming in and declaring their right in France, and there's two kings in France, because it happened over
Well,
such
sure.
a long
And I mean,
period.
like, if you think people gossip over royalty now,
Yeah, yeah, like you can only imagine.
when they legitimately were leading the country, it was a lot worse.
Yeah. So, so Charles VII at the time, he's kind of hiding. He's dressed like a normal person, and he's actually hiding amongst his own military, like his bodyguards and stuff.
Mhm.
So you wouldn't necessarily be able to point him out in a crowd type of thing. So the legend actually says when she went to go see Charles VII, he was with his people. He was dressed like everybody else. And she had never seen him before. And she knew exactly who he was. And she went to him immediately and like dropped on one knee and like pledged her allegiance to him. And immediately he knew that like something was special about her and about her message.
Mhm.
And of course she came telling him he's gonna become the king,
Right.
so
Yeah.
he believed in her, and he's the one that actually commissioned her a suit of armor that would actually fit her shape and made her
Right.
a sword and everything like that. So he creates that armor for her. She starts dressing in the style we know Joan of Arc, like in this military uniform, like medieval
Mhm.
armor. And now she starts to go out and campaign on his behalf, right? So first of all, there's this whole conversation around Orléans, or what we would think of as Orleans. Like I said, it's the gateway kind of into France, and the British and the Burgundians at the time, they really want it because if they can capture it, it's kind of like, you know, from
They can
there
cut
they
the
can start they
rest.
can start going into the south and like take the rest, right?
Mhm.
So it's a huge strategic point. And this is the first campaign that she's a part of. And she's determined that they will not capture Orleans.
Mhm.
So, of course, they have the battle. And the thing is like the French are kind of losing constantly up into this point. They're kind of getting ravaged by the British armies.
Mhm.
And so the battle begins, and kind of the same thing happens, whereas the British are kind of overtaking the French and they're having a really hard time, and eventually they pull back because it's too difficult. But Joan of Arc comes through waving her, it's like a movie, right? Comes through with like her banner for France, and like all of these men watching this woman with this like, it also reminded me of Boudica a little bit when we were talking
Yeah, it
about Celtic
sounds
mythology, the way
yeah.
that she came through like with this like determination, and she wasn't going to relent. It like reinvigorated everybody, and they turned back around and they actually started fighting harder, and they managed to beat off all the English. And so this is interesting because now everybody has drank the Joan of Arc Kool-Aid, right? Because they win their first battle in a really long time, and it's because of her message, because like she has
Right.
re-imbued them with a certain level of belief, right? And so they go on to have a few more battles against the English, and it leads to essentially like a winning streak for them.
Mhm.
And then because of this, King Charles VII is officially crowned the King of France in Rheims, in the cathedral in Rheims, France, the great cathedral.
Wow.
And Joan of Arc is right beside him. So she's like his
Oh, very
champion.
prominent position. Yeah.
Yeah, she's like his champion.
Mhm.
It really reminded me also while I was reading this, Michael and I watched this movie that came out last year the other day called The Woman King. Have you heard of it?
I don't think so.
Oh, it's
What's it on?
amazing. Where did we watch it? I think we watched it on Amazon Prime, and it's the
Okay.
story about it's a true story about an elite group of military in Africa that were like all women. Like the whole
Cool.
military was women, and it takes place in the 1800s. Um and it's really really good, and it's about this woman female commander of this female military that ends up becoming like a counterpart king to the king of this part of the like this country in Africa. It's
Yeah.
fascinating, it was
Cool.
really good, but
Cool.
it really reminded me of that. So anyways, she is really now being exalted at this point by everybody that believes in Charles VII, and now he's become the
Mhm.
king, and it's quite great. Unfortunately, things, winning streaks don't always last.
What goes up must come down.
Yeah, and there are a few instances where this is one thing that also kind of I think leads to her sainthood. There's a battle that happens after that where she actually gets an arrow right in the neck, like between the neck and the collarbone, and
Okay.
this is usually a deadly shot. It's like right after the king gets taken, she gets into this battle and she gets shot right in the neck,
Mhm.
and somehow she manages to live, which is also kind
Maybe
of
she was a ghoul.
it also speaks
That's for
to
anyone who's watched Fallout.
okay, ghoul to some, saint to others, I don't know. She basically survives. And at one point, when things start to go sideways, she's kind of always noted as never wanting to leave the front line. She never, she gets injured a bunch more times. It's lucky she doesn't die. And all of those times she refuses to leave her comrades. Like she doesn't want to leave the front line. So even when she's injured, she's like there. She's staying there to like make sure like everything, the battle is okay, like everything is going okay for a battle, I guess.
Yeah.
And all of this. But they do start to lose some battles, and basically she goes into one battle that King Charles VII doesn't actually want her to go on, and it's against
Mhm.
the Burgundians, but she's really basically everybody's sick of the war. And people are and now that King Charles VII has made some progress, people are talking about treaties.
Right.
He wants to sign a truce. But the thing is that Joan of Arc she's deeply traumatized, obviously, and she does
Mhm.
not believe or trust the English or the Burgundians. She doesn't see a single way that this could be resolved peacefully. And in her mind, the only way to win France completely is to keep attacking, like keep going after them, be relentless. So she is like,
That is such a trauma response where that's the only thing she knows.
yeah, she's clocked, man. Like
Yeah.
I really feel that. I think this is why I was crying when I was listening to this story and watching this story, because you can tell she just will not feel safe in their until they're
Yeah.
completely out of the country. And so
Mhm.
she is becoming more and more determined to keep fighting. And everybody else is like, if we can stop and save people, like that's a better way to go. You know what I mean? But she
Yeah.
doesn't want to let up. So she does take a small campaign to go into another battle, and they do not do well. And at this point, she is captured by the Burgundians, which, like I said, are French, but they're technically French. They're Burgundians. They weren't really French, but they're kind of like
Yeah.
French, but
And they're working with the British. Yeah.
they're allied to
They're
the
allied.
British. So
Mhm.
even though they're allied to the British, the Burgundians know how powerful she is, how important she is. And so they'll only give her up in exchange for money. So they essentially sell
They
her
ransom her.
to the
Okay.
British. And the
Yeah.
British, knowing how important she is, they pay the money. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then at this time, so this is around 1430 to 1431. So this is between the ages of 18 and 19 years old for her. She's
Mhm.
captured and then she's put on trial by the Burgundians and the English. And she's basically put through a witch trial, like to paraphrase everything that they do to her. They put her on a stretching rack, they do all of these things.
Mhm.
They basically subject her to a whole bunch of different tortures and stuff, and they put her on a trial. And of course all the people that are on the board for the trial are people that are against King Charles the Seventh.
Mhm.
And it's not
Mhm.
like anybody can get to her because she's not in her safe territory anymore, right?
Right.
So of course the trial is wildly biased. And finally, at a certain point in the trial, she kind of succumbs to all of the pressure and being in jail. And she
Mhm.
signs a confession. And so they accuse her of heresy because they say
Mhm.
that the voices that she's hearing from God are demonic, not God.
Of course.
And then they also charge her for cross dressing because she's been dressing
Oh,
like a boy
right.
in military
Right.
clothing. And that was apparently like illegal at this period.
Mhm. Mhm.
So she obviously fights it for quite
Mhm.
some time, but she's very worn down. And so she succumbs and she signs a confession.
Like
And
many people did under duress.
yeah. And then
It's
yeah, exactly. She signs a confession and then she's kind of put into like a jail with like a bit of a better condition
Mhm.
where they're figuring out what they're going to do to her. And she feels honestly like incredibly guilt ridden because she feels like she turned on like the one thing that she actually really believed in, which was King
Yeah, she
Charles
feels like
becoming the
she's
king.
sold out a little bit.
Yeah. And so after about a week, she kind of like rebuilds her strength and she recants her confession. She takes it back. And because she takes it back, she's sentenced to be burned alive at the stake. Yeah.
Thumbs up.
Yeah.
Great.
So
Yep.
so this is what happens, and she is burned at the stake in 1431 at the age of 19 years old. And this is the full story of Joan of Arc.
Joan of
It's
Arc.
wild. But also important to know that I think it's like I think it's either 20 years after or in the 20s. I can't remember, but
Okay.
at some point when the country is much more stabilized, the country of France decides to, like, the noble, like the people in charge of France at the time, they decide to investigate Joan of Arc's story and Joan of Arc's claim and what happened to her. I think it's 20 years after the
Yeah,
war.
because like, how long does it take for news of her being burned at the stake to get
Mm.
back to the people
I
who
mean,
were fighting with her?
I'm sure they knew it was gonna happen. I'm sure when she got
I mean,
captured,
they
they
probably
found
knew that
out.
she was gonna die as soon as she was ransomed to the British, but
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how long it took for them to find out, but I'm sure as soon as they found out that she got captured by the British, they probably knew that it was like coming to an end
game
for
over.
her. And I don't really
Yeah,
know that there was much that they could do to stop it, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
years and years after all of this happens, they decide to reopen the case related to Joan of Arc and reinvestigate it. And at this time, they absolve her of everything. So the church decides, no, she wasn't hearing voices, she was hearing the word of God. This was
Hmm.
the right thing to do. She did everything right, and the British were like the fucked up ones, basically. And so, because of this, she is exalted. And then it's not until the 1920s, and this is why I was
Hmm.
getting confused. I couldn't remember what happened first, but it's not until the 1920s that Joan of Arc is declared a martyr and a saint by the Catholic Church.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wonder what took them
And
so
that's the
long.
period in which she's canonized. I think it's probably like most things, it's just like it depends on when it becomes important again, you know.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So
I just,
in
yeah, I mean, there's certain elements of the story where, like the men were kind of flagging and their energy was being lost, and then Joan of Arc comes again, and there's a part of me, there's like the cynical part that's like, did they drink the Joan of Arc Kool-Aid in that moment, or did they not want to be shown up by a woman, where they
yeah,
were like, well, she's not giving up, so why would, and then it
sure.
worked
Sure.
to their benefit. And because I feel like that's also part of the reason that she was kind of targeted and treated poorly by the British, right? It's like this woman
Sure.
in power who's pretending to be a man, and like, no, that's not the woman's place.
Yeah.
Out in the
No.
house fighting battles.
I thought about it too. I was like, did they all turn around and fight just because they didn't want to see a woman do it first? Like, I also had the exact same thought when I was like thinking about it. But I also I think it's hard for us to remember that there was a point in time where there was a certain fervor for religion, and like people, there
Yes.
were people that truly did believe. So I am assuming it was a mixed bag, like
Hmm.
or all of those things all at the same time. So maybe on one hand it was because she was a woman, but also it was like, look at what this woman is doing. Like it could have been,
God must be with her for her to be doing this.
emotions are murky,
Yeah.
you know, like, and
Yeah.
they're sometimes made up of insecurity and faith all at the same time.
Hmm. No,
So
it's very valid.
yeah, so that could also be it. But I think, it's definitely like a harrowing story. Like you're like listening to it or watching it or reading it, and you're just like, damn, this
Well, and
girl.
in like the span of 2 years,
Mm.
she really like went up and then slammed right back down.
And I think ultimately, like, the fact is, though, she was the turning point for the
Hmm.
French in the war, because eventually it did come to an end. So she did kind of like reinvigorate them.
Hmm.
to keep going, and she did get the king crowned, which
Yes,
was
yeah, she
clearly
did.
no easy feat at that point.
No,
So
and that was her intention. And so it is kind of funny, like if that's the intention, how far do you go with it? And then the rest truly is just a trauma response where like you said, like she
she
just
just
wouldn't feel
kept
safe
going.
otherwise. It's kind of a
Yeah, maybe it
tragic
was that. I
story.
mean, like I think of her as a woman, so I think of that, but maybe also she was just like war. She could have also very much been like war is the only answer, just like many men commanders in military can be. Like
Yeah.
once you see the results with that, and I think probably she had lived her entire life with the British ultimately like dehumanizing her and her people, so she was not in the mood to be humanizing them. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So like that's the
Yeah.
crazy shit that war does to people, right? So yeah.
I know, and then it turns into this vicious cycle and like
Mhm.
we know now that it's a lot of hard work to break that, but it's really important that we do.
Yeah, but I don't think we were like thinking that deeply at that point in time.
No.
People were just trying to
No.
survive a lot for a lot of
I
it.
get it. I
This
get
is
it.
why education is important. But that's another story. Education is what gets people thinking about this stuff. It gets people to
Yeah.
ask themselves like deeper questions about how they are in the world, and that's why it's important.
It's so interesting
And
now
that's my
too
commercial
though. Like
for
there was
education
such yeah,
systems.
the more you know. Remember those? Like with the little star? Anyway.
Yeah.
Um it's so interesting too because I wonder obviously there was a very different religious tolerance at that point. There was a lot of religious fervor, but you always think about if someone were to come around and be like, I have these messages from God, these visions from God, these this, these that, like if they actually gain traction now, we would look at them and just be like, oh, it's a cult leader.
Yeah.
That's
Oh,
a cult. Like that's not real.
I think about this all the time. And I think in some ways we really have to look at ourselves on that because also like that's what we have been doing since like Jesus,
Oh
the
yeah.
story of Jesus.
I
Like
know.
Jesus was
I know.
also heavily criticized, right? Like and technically you could consider Jesus a cult leader if you wanted to. I have no beef with Jesus for the record, but like I'm just being,
No, it's true. But, you know, for people who do believe in Jesus and they're like people who believe in the second coming, if someone comes around and they say all of this stuff,
mm,
most of the world's going to be like, that guy's
weirdo,
nuts,
at least
right?
weirdo. Yeah. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I totally I think about that stuff all the time. And then at the same time there's also something it's again that two things can be true because you can feel like that and then there is something that pulls on you from that story. Like
Mhm.
me not even feeling religious, I immediately like have empathy for Joan of Arc and like everything that she
Yeah.
did and everything that she went through and everything that she believed and that she chose to believe in herself. She chose to believe that everything was true for her. And
Mhm.
then it
Mhm.
worked, you know what I mean? Like it turned out to be, it worked. It kind of changed the trajectory of the war. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So there's something really powerful in that as well, I think. And I think that's why the story is so well rounded and so complete. And also because of all of this, she's considered a patron saint of the country of France, which is why
Right.
she's got a statue in every church.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Right? I was like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, this tracks now. I get it. Because you can literally light a candle to her in every church I've ever been in France. So that's the
That makes
story.
sense. Patron saint of the country.
Yeah.
That's cool because yeah, like you said, you know kind of the story of Joan of Arc. You know that she was this warrior of sorts, but I
Mhm.
never really bothered to look into
The
the
detail.
details too
Yeah.
much. There's just
Yeah.
I just didn't care to. So that was really cool. It's a
That's
tragic story.
it's tragic. Like many like Saint has a tragic story. Like that's kind of why we've been doing well, we've been doing Saints, but we've been finding most of them have been pretty. Don't worry, I'm gonna do one about a man. It's not tragic.
Maybe we should leave it here for
Yeah, for
today.
sure.
That was really
Mhm.
cool. Thank you. I learned a lot.
It's a
Um,
surprisingly
Joan of
interesting
Arc's
one, isn't
pretty
it?
neat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna be thinking about that one for quite a bit of time, I
Props.
think.
Yeah. She
'Cause
deserves her props, I think.
yeah,
Mhm.
it's definitely like a much more complex story than we normally get, especially
And I think because it's got historical relevance to it, it's kind of the reason why the story is more filled out. Like a lot of this,
For
a lot of the
sure,
saint
because I'm sure
stories.
it is recorded in history books as well
Yeah.
as religious texts.
There's a whole other thing
So,
related to the fact that nobody really knows what she looked like. There's only
mm,
one doodle, like in some French drawings, that would give it an indication, and it doesn't look like anything of what we would think. But there's many physical descriptions of what she looks like, so that's where everybody's
mhm.
caught the idea of what they think she might have looked like. Yeah.
I'm gonna look into that too.
Yeah. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this the very nuanced story of Joan of Arc. And if you are interested in us covering a different type of story, different type of saint, whatever you want, you can always get in touch with us at allegorystorypodcast@gmail.com or on Instagram at allegorystory.
Allegory Story Podcast. Yeah.